Warning, Josh is not an expert in any of the crap he talks about. He simply uses his head and does a lot of research so you, the audience, don't have to. Keep in mind, he doesn't know everything, so take the he says with a grain of salt.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Quarantino. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscription button and notification bell so you get updates on future videos. Now, this is going to be a bit of a unorthodox episode compared to my last ones because most of them has just been about myself, and then I obviously don't do it over Zoom. But this is definitely a special episode, and I have a very special guest, Professor Craig Calhoun. If you want to introduce yourself.
Well, hi, Josh. I am Craig Calhoun from ASU, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and to have you experiment in having guests.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm definitely glad I got to have you as the first one, especially with all the stuff that we're going to be talking about. And then just so that way our audience has a bit of a background with some of your stuff. You're currently a university professor of social sciences. And then you're also the co-author of 8 books and more than 100 different articles that range on culture, social movements, education, communication, religion, and many other things as well. And then you also
Sounds like me.
And then he also served as the president of the Social Science Research Council and then of the London School of Economics and Political Science. So you definitely have a lot of experience in regards to what we're talking about in regards to the clear social movements going on currently in the US, as well as a lot of the societal issues that are definitely coming up. So to go and start it off, just to see what issues are you currently seeing that are most prevalent right now in the US?
There are so many. There are the crises of democracy, the polarization, the deep divisions and clashes, the escalated rhetoric that are undermining the unity of democratic citizens. There's the extremes of inequality that have built up over the last 50 years. There's the challenge of race, which is back at the top of our agenda, but kind of never leaves the agenda in the United States. It comes up to the top, it moves down, it moves back, but it's an issue which just keeps challenging the country. Obviously, there's the pandemic, but there are also other things, climate change and other risks that we face in this era that we are moving into, and that we face, I think, with somewhat damaged social foundations for dealing with them. And so there's the issue of how do we repair those?
Yeah, because definitely what I'm seeing, what's happening with that social issues, that's at least from my perspective as part of the millennial generation and growing up with social media and technology, I'm seeing that a lot of these rifts and social conflicts are also stemming from what happens with social media, where these echo chambers form and whatnot.
Right. Well, I think they're made worse by social media and by the echo chambers. I would caution against thinking that's where they all come from.
Okay.
They may come from various kinds of problems that are unresolved in society or ideologies and so forth. But the impact of social media is partly to encourage echo chambers, as you said, partly to give people freedom for a more aggressive rhetorical clash with each other that they wouldn't always do in person, and partly to link up over long distances, to have a sense of critical mass. So, you may not have very many neo-Nazis in your neighborhood, but the one who's there can link up with others online in other places and have a sense of being a part of something bigger. Add in hacking and the challenges there. So there are a bunch of media effects, but I think media didn't create these issues all by itself. And there are previous examples of many of these deep divisions, like I was just saying, around race.
Yeah. Okay. So the social media and technology, it more so kind of like is attributing to it. It's not the sole creation of it, but
it's an exacerbator in a sense.
Okay. Yeah, because something I definitely see a lot too with social media, especially when it pertains to things with race, ethnicity, things like that. That's where a lot of these echo chambers especially come up because of just how sensitive a topic it is. And I know Facebook, social media, it gives a platform to really give a voice to people that are victims of such abuses.
Yeah.
But I think now what we're seeing, especially like with Antifa, for example, and how they've been having the groups linked through Facebook and everything, that's leading to this radicalization of a mindset, if that makes
So
sense, or if I'm hitting
yeah,
on
no, that
something.
makes sense. I think there are multiple questions. One is how do people get mobilized, and they use social media to get mobilized.
Hmm.
Another is how does it change their attitudes, like sort of radicalizing, making more extreme, reshaping in that sense. It has to be said that it's not that social media only does bad things or only connects
Yeah,
bad people, right?
yeah,
It is a source of connections that works for lots of people, and good causes as well as bad. There is unfortunately some research evidence that falsehoods spread faster than truth and corrections of falsehoods,
hmm,
and they stick around longer. So it appears that the new media are not helping our ability to get to the truth of matters. Um,
yeah,
and
because
that's probably true on all sides of issues.
yeah, and what I see too, especially with that, because like with YouTubers, they use the clickbait algorithm to get that attention quickly. And what happens a lot that I see on Facebook, and I've even fell victim to it, where it's the rage bait, and I click and I just fall into it. But they only give you like a first headliner that depicts this whole kind of situation, and the rest of it, it's either just kind of filler, or if it's mixed with some kind of bias. And even if it's based off false information, they still roll with it. And like with a lot of mainstream media, there's a lack of accountability, where that false information and those false accusations has led to some detrimental effects on the livelihood of those individuals.
Oh, I
Uh,
think you're exactly right, Josh, on this. Let me just pull out 2 points from it. One is the shortened attention span, that often people read the headline and then they click on the next thing, right?
mhm.
And so they think they've gotten the story, whatever it is, without going very deeply into it.
Right.
The second is that the combination of social media with available online resources often gives people the illusion of having done a lot of research,
Right.
right? Like, somebody sent me a link and I followed it. Then I went to 3 other websites. Now I know the real picture. I've thoroughly investigated the story. I've done my research. I know the truth. But maybe all of those websites were crap.
Yeah.
Maybe they were all ideologically biased. That it's not true that just going to 3 or 4 or 5 guarantees anything.
Yeah, and especially with the level of bias and misinformation that's going around now, it's very difficult to be able to mitigate and try to find the right actual information. So that's why usually whenever I have any kind of debate or argument with someone else discussing things like that, I try to stay close to the more factual information rather than jumping on that clickbait. Because I've fell victim to that a couple times. Like for example, with scandals that opened up against the Obama administration, things with Kamala Harris, for example. So I've been victim to that. I know the I wouldn't say maybe manipulation would be the right word, but the level of manipulation and and perception that goes with it, I would say. So I would fall into it, but
Well,
that's why
everybody
I'm
does. I
exactly.
mean, even the people who are pretty careful to try to be factual occasionally get fooled sometimes.
Mhm.
And, that can be not even words, it can be visual things. Like when there was a tsunami in Japan, there were a lot of visual images that were sort of faked, showing the wave bigger than it was and um, making it more dramatic. And, who knows? You're not there in Japan watching the wave. So it takes a fair amount
Yeah.
of effort to stay clear of the misinformation.
Yeah, like for example, too, because obviously, like immigration, for example, is a very difficult thing to discuss because all the things that come with it. But I noticed that there's a lot of propaganda that comes with that too. Like for example, the picture of the children in cages. Um, and there's a couple of those where it's actually been found that the picture that they used for our article to reference what's happening now in the last 4 years was either from an entirely different country or was actually from a previous presidential administration, like the Obama administration. So I see stuff like that, and that's why I usually put in more conscious effort to try to figure out what the truth is, and I try to stay more steadfast on it.
Mhm.
And I think that's something too, especially that our society as a whole needs to especially do with all that's going on.
Well, for sure, we need to do that. My point would just be, it's not easy. So we can laugh at people who get taken in by QAnon or some um, conspiracy theory or set of illusions on the web, but we need to be careful not to just laugh, to realize that in varying degree we can all be taken in, and that it is incumbent on all of us to try to be careful about what we regard as the true and factual sources for things.
Yeah, especially with how ignorance is becoming such a thing where people are being so more difficult to understand each other's side.
Yeah.
That's where it
Well,
especially comes
yeah,
up to.
I mean, two things there. I mean, that's, you're quite right. One is ignorance, and some people may be more ignorant than others, but nobody knows everything. So there's also the kind of arrogance or hubris of thinking you know things outside any area of specialization or any area of real expertise. So I
Right.
think it's not being humble before ignorance. Sometimes that's the problem, not just the ignorance. And the other thing is the extent to which people will stick to a message like it's their team. And even if your team is down, you're still going to cheer for them. And
Yeah.
they'll act as though a certain kind of false information belongs to their team, so they have to believe it and they have to stick to it no matter what evidence is presented, because it's their false information.
Yeah, and a lot of that I believe, because what I noticed, especially too, typically on the far left side of things with the extremist groups, is that they more so tug on like the emotional ties, those personal experiences, in order to kind of get the team to go on in that manner. At least that's
Yeah,
what
I'm
I've
not
seen in my
sure
own experience.
that's I'm sure that's true, but it's not left or right. I think that's true of
Yeah,
both sides. So I think it'd be
yeah,
a wrong generalization to say the left tugs on emotional issues and the right doesn't. Both sides touch on emotional issues. Think of the use of images in the anti-abortion movement, or
correct.
the recent accusation. Joe Biden believes that there should be sex change operations for 8 years old kids, and so that's also meant to play on something emotional when it gets to people, to not just be
Yeah,
rational. So I think it is in the nature of the combination of sort of extreme partisan opposition with the media that you get these bypasses of rational discussion in
mhm.
favor of pure emotional appeals.
Yeah, because and that's where the clickbait and the rage bait always ties into effect too. And so that's why I've always kind of maintained the mentality that in order to be able to understand and accept other people's opinions and their thoughts and everything without like resorting to arguments, fights, stuff like that, I've always maintained the mindset that everything that I learn, everything that I got taught, and everything could be entirely wrong, because I mean, mankind has been proved wrong time and time again before.
Sure.
So I try to maintain that mentality, so that way I can not only be open to other opinions, thoughts, and ideologies, but it gives that opportunity for me to establish the empathy and to understand it, and then be able to rebuttal with my own side as well.
Mm-hmm. No, good. I mean, I think that the combination of humility, willing to be corrected, um, and listening to whoever else you're talking to, not just wanting to tell them everything,
Yeah,
is very important. Otherwise, you can't have a dialogue. And
exactly.
it's very unlikely that everything you believe is wrong, right? It may be the case that something you believe is wrong.
Yeah,
And I think people sometimes are a little bit afraid. You're telling me I don't know anything. Well, no, I'm telling you there's this one issue on which you're probably confused.
yeah,
And I think very few people, even the people we would think are real extremists of left or right or on certain emotional issues,
mhm,
not they don't know anything. In fact,
Right.
if they're able to do this, they know something. If they're able to get online, they're able to push their point of view. They may
Exactly.
be distorting things, but they're not totally out of touch.
Yeah, and it's especially too because I see that often enough. At least what I constantly see on the news in regards to like looking online, all the articles, especially a lot of stuff that with Facebook and everything too. What I've been seeing on the outskirts of well, like with colleges, universities. I could be entirely wrong on that part because I know that you're in the university, so you know exactly what's going on. But where I see like with socialism, for example, I think there was a study that came out that showed like 20% of students don't understand socialism. But there's like bias where there's clear bias that's showing to where they're only being fed this part of the argument without giving a chance to look at the other side.
So, yeah, probably. So let me give my side of that story, which would be
Yeah.
first, it's really hard to say in universities this or that because there are a lot of different universities and they're different.
Yeah.
And the some of them are very different ideologically. You know, there are evangelical Christian universities. There are universities that are very elite and serve mainly rich and privileged kids. There are
Right.
universities that are mainly about kids who are trying to move up and improve their situation. So, you know, there are really different universities and really different student populations. So I'd be cautious about generalizations that say this is what goes on in universities
Yeah.
on any subject. On you know, in general, having said that, I think it's probably true that faculty members in universities tilt more towards the center left than they tilt towards the right.
Mhm.
I don't think very many of them tilt to the extreme left.
Right.
And I think you're talking about somewhere from center to somewhat left as the
Yeah.
dominant ethos. But even there, really different. Like the studies that have been done of this show, the typical attitudes of engineering professors are really different from the typical attitudes of historians or
Yeah.
whatever. And so that doesn't mean there's no truth to what you're saying, that there are ideologies in the university. It means that you've got to be careful about generalizing too much on that. With regard to socialism, um, who has the correct understanding of what socialism is? When we say, oh, well, 20% of university students don't understand it. 20% do I understand? I'm impressed. What is it they don't understand? The history of socialism in this country or in other countries,
I
the difference between socialism and communism, the particular claims of democratic socialism. I mean, what is it that they do or do not understand? I would want to ask, right? If somebody came and said, as you just said, 20% of students understand socialism, I want to know what the definition of understanding socialism was. And the same thing for understanding conservatism or
mhm.
understanding liberalism or understanding, any of these big political ideologies. You might mean their history. You might mean a sort of philosophical understanding. You might mean the practical impact they had in some context.
Right. So, and I think definitely right there, that's a good example of that generalization because my personal opinion that was on that in regards to universities and colleges, that's also someone that's stepped out from the background. And I also, me being someone who's also flooded with all these fake articles, fake news and misinformation. So I think like even that could stem because I don't think it's the entirety of the universities and colleges that do that. I know that they're going to all vary that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's as the average Joe having the lack of proper information, especially with all the fake media, I think that's where that definitely causes a misconception right there, I think.
Yeah. And, people like me don't always help because university professors will too easily fall into saying, oh, well, here's what we university professors think without
Yeah.
saying, well, actually, it's only some. I'm an economist and I think like this. But then there are other economists who think differently, let alone professors of physics who think in still another way. And so it's a bad habit of professors to speak as though they have the general truth across everything, right?
Right.
Rather than on the basis of their specific knowledge, right? So, I know some things about engineering, but if you want to know about engineering, I'm a really bad source. I know a lot more about politics, society, culture, history,
Right.
and I'm a better source on that. But even there, I don't know about every aspect of history in the world and all periods and so forth. So I think that part of the humility we were talking about before, even for people with PhDs and famous professors and everything else,
Mm-hmm.
needs to be being sort of clear what you have pretty good knowledge of, what you
Right.
have some expertise on, and what you don't. And so, the world's greatest expert on political science may not be a very good authority on Shakespeare, and you shouldn't take his opinion as though it's authoritative, and vice versa.
Right. And because I forgot to touch on what you're asking about in regards to like the socialism and that article, it was, I think it was about like 4 or 5 months ago when that article came out. So I very foggy memory. I only remember the thumbnail and the first sentence of it, but that's kind of a misconception. But like with the fundamentals of socialism, because I've tried to do my best to really research that stuff and everything in comparison to like capitalism. And my understanding on socialism is that it's something believed to be introduced in the dying stages of capitalism. It believes that capitalism is what created the sense of competitiveness amongst humans, and that socialism, part of that belief is that all mankind are naturally cooperative in every way, and that's essentially how we should be. It might kind of hitting the
Well, you're
nail on
not
that
in
a
the
little bit.
wrong ballpark, but we
Yeah.
could push on specifics. So if it was like a forced choice, do you believe people are naturally competitive or naturally cooperative? Most socialists would probably say, well, I'm more on the cooperative side,
Yeah.
but most would probably say, hey, it's not an either or. Think of a football team.
Hmm.
They're extremely competitive with the other team, but that requires them to be cooperative with each other.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a
and
blend of
and
both.
so it can't be an either or, right? I mean, whether it's a football game or a war or a factory, it requires cooperation inside in order to be competitive outside.
Right.
And so human nature gives us the capability of each. And many socialists, I think, would say we've exaggerated the necessity of competition and we've underestimated the importance of cooperation, which isn't saying it's an either or.
Right.
But a couple of other things just about socialism while we're on it, which is there are lots of varieties of it in different countries, different times and histories and so forth. And what Bernie Sanders means when he says he's a democratic socialist is not the same as what everybody who's ever said they're a socialist means.
Yeah.
But one thing that kind of runs through that, which isn't so obviously left or right, is that the social is important.
Hmm.
That imagining there's a world of economics that doesn't have anything to do with social life, or a world of politics that doesn't. So that I think what many socialists would say is, the social is really important, the way in which we are socially connected to each other. And ironically, they're closer to many conservatives than they are to some liberal capitalists or something,
Right.
because the conservative tradition has been full of people saying, look, community matters. We shouldn't let the market destroy community. Religion matters. We shouldn't let social change destroy religion.
Right.
Now, socialists may or may not be focused on religion, but they are focused on community and they are focused on the social relations we have. So, if I can just extend the example, when you have deindustrialization and you close down the factories that are the main source of life for some steel town in Western Pennsylvania, or for that matter, mining and what's happening in Arizona,
Mhm.
what happens is not just economic. You can't just say, oh, well, that's a purely market phenomenon, because
Right.
it's the destruction of a community and of people's whole network of relationships with each other and their ability to live their lives the way they want to. So, from my point of view, saying community matters isn't exactly left or right. It's something shared between conservatives and socialists. But then how do you fix that? What do you do can lead to pretty different.
Yeah, the whole implication behind it, because this is just a example, because everyone's going to understand with Avengers, for example, how at the very end Thanos was saying that he was going to wipe out the entire universe and start it over again, and it'd be a peaceful one. It's that violent transition, for example, where it's the means to get to that kind of varies in the ideologies. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely, but it doesn't vary neatly on left and right. Let me just,
Yeah.
I mean, I push on this because close to my own expertise I know about.
Yeah.
This is where the Russian Revolution and the Nazis are kind of on the same page, the communists and the far right, right? And the Nazis are actually the National Socialists in their official name. But what they share is the idea that the existing order is so corrupt, we have to smash it and start over and build something different. At least that's the ideology. Now, when you look at the actual practices, it's not quite that clear cut. The Nazis want to keep certain things about Germanists and all that.
Right.
But I think that one of the kinds of extremism, left or right, is what you point to as this demand for a do-over.
Right.
And one of the hallmarks of the rest of the political spectrum, from center right to center left or whatever, is the recognition that there isn't a do-over. You can move forward, you can try to fix problems, but smashing things will usually lead to worse problems.
Yeah. The whole concept of two wrongs don't make a right, because it's kind of you worsen your own cause at the same time, and you degenerate the value of that cause and the values and morals that was supposed to bring as well.
Yeah, and you open the door to all sorts of other problems. So, for myself, violent revolution is a bad plan, even if you believe in what the revolutionaries are trying to get. It's a bad way to get it. You won't get it, right? Like, you look at the Russian Revolution, and a lot of people who participated in it wanted workers' self-government. Well, they didn't get that. They got an extremely strong state dominating, right?
Yeah.
And revolution usually strengthens the state, right? And so if you want less power from the central state, revolution's a bad way to go about getting that, even if you're justifiably angry at the existing state, the existing government.
Yeah, because I remember reading about the Red Terror with Vladimir Lenin when he was on his rise to power, and I forget the name of the police that he created, but based off what I was reading, that police was supposed to target people that were in association with the Tsar, those of wealth and everything. And when at that time he was also nationalizing the agriculture industry, and which that ultimately went to effect where, if I remember correctly, there was like 5 million Ukrainians that had passed away from manufactured famines, and that'd be kind of like an example of that too, where it's the means of transition as well as the problems where it's the human element that adds that level of corruption and power, I'd say.
It's the human element, absolutely. And part of the human element is not individual, it's the social organization, right? So if you try to attack the family, for example, and you say, oh, the family's tying people to bad habits, you run into a bunch of other ways in which we depend on families. Well, then how are, people going to take care of each other and of children and things? So there are various examples of societies that have tried to reduce reliance on the typical family. And it turns out to be really hard to do.
Right.
My point is not just about the family, it's about, that's an example of how we as people are not just individuals, but are socially connected, and we depend on those social connections. So peasants in Russia depended on their villages. They may not have been completely fair, they may not have been completely equal, but when the villages were completely eliminated in favor of collective farms or something, that made them vulnerable to the state in a new way.
Yeah.
And the same thing go for the right. I mean, you've got people now who are saying, say in among some parts of the populist right in the United States, the MAGA crowd, the federal government is doing all of this bad stuff to us, right? We're really angry. Therefore, we want to have a strong leader in the federal government who will
Yeah.
fire a lot of people and put in our other people. And so, well, wait a minute, that's actually building the strength of it. I mean, that, the government budget hasn't gone down, it's just shifted from this expense to that expense.
Mhm.
If you want to decentralize, then you have to decentralize, not just change who the central power is.
Yeah, exactly. Because I know every administration, they typically bring in their own people to be able to continue on what their goals and what kind of policies
Sure.
they want to implement and whatnot.
Yes, although you're going to get really tired of me saying yes, but
No
but
worries.
but what you say is absolutely true. Every administration does that. Over time, over the last few decades, the pattern has been to go deeper and deeper. So usually government is a balance between, if you will, bureaucrats, technical experts, long-term people, or to give it a more positive label, the civil service.
Right.
Right. And so if you're running the post office or you're running the water system or you're running the army, right, you have professionals to do it.
Mhm.
Right. And the question is, how far do you go in replacing those professionals with political appointees? So every administration will do the very top level. It will have its own Secretary of Defense. But most administrations would not second guess the generals, the Joint
Yeah.
Chiefs of Staff, the professionals. One of the things unusual about the Trump administration, it's been willing to get politics deeper into that. Same with science. The every administration would want oversight over this, want to decide, well, how much budget should we put in this or that? And that's true left, right. What's new is deciding to go 2, 3, 4 layers down, replacing the people who have professional technical expertise and knowledge with political appointees. Now, that's something that's extreme right now, and I think a big issue with the Trump administration, but they didn't start it. It's something that's been going on, both Democrats and Republicans, more and more and more as our politics becomes more dominated by presidents trying to get their way
Mhm.
rather than by a more cooperative structure among the different parts of government.
Right. Yeah. And good example of that too, because with the whole bringing it to 3, 4 levels down with Benghazi, for example, because I had read Ben Shapiro's book about the people versus Obama, and one of the cases that he was referencing was the Benghazi, and the way that the whole summary with that went was that there was already plans for the U.S. embassy in Benghazi to be attacked, and there was prior warning in advance. And there's private messages, emails, and different form of letters that were sent to the Obama administration to let them know that, hey, we need more security, we need more lines of defense, because they were stripped bare minimum. And that was a situation where they were let known long time in advance, so they knew about it. And then when it actually came down to it, it the blame was primarily shifted to people that was 3, 4 levels below, and to where it's that political alliance where they have that bias, if that makes sense, to where they're having their own people in those low levels to kind of help mitigate what their goals and intents are.
So, yeah, this is sort of mixing together two things. And I'm not especially expert on Libya and Benghazi and all that. So, but I think there are two truths. These are both things that are true in what you're saying, but they're sort of different.
Yeah.
One is that we hardly ever succeed in holding the top people accountable. The blame always gets shifted to someone farther down. For my
Yeah.
generation, you can think of this as the Lieutenant Calley problem. Lieutenant Calley was a guy who got court-martialed in the Vietnam War for something that had clearly come from higher ups in the military hierarchy who made him take the blame for it.
Right.
But there are lots and lots of examples of this. So I think that's a widespread truth, that the blame will get shifted down. It'll be hard to hold the real top people accountable.
Right.
But the other thing is, who is in this chain of administration or communication, right?
Right.
Do you have diplomats in a country who have some expertise and knowledge about that country, who maybe speak the language? And one of the famous comments in the Iranian Revolution, 1979, is the US embassy didn't have many people, I can't remember, do they have one or something, but people who spoke Farsi, who spoke the local language, who could get the information in good ways. And so what I would point to, and again, I think it's grown across both Democrats and Republicans. I think it's unusually extreme in the current administration, but it's not just Republicans who've done this, is trying to substitute people who are loyal to your political cause for people who actually know how to get something done in a particular area. And so, it can be diplomacy and how to actually get the facts about a country you're working in, which comes up over and over again. It can be much more technical things, engineering or emergency management. One of the big issues with Hurricane Katrina was, did the Federal Emergency Management Association know what to do? Well, there was somebody who had no technical knowledge, but had been a campaign donor, who was in charge of it, who ended up being in charge of trying to get relief to all the victims of that hurricane in New Orleans and Louisiana, who basically didn't know what he's doing. And so, it's a tension. It's not an easy, clear cut, one side good, one side bad thing, because democracy depends on the people being able to elect a government that has some control over the bureaucracy.
Right.
But if that government's like what we were talking about at the beginning, if that political government isn't humble about knowledge and thinks it knows everything, and it starts replacing all of the technical specialists with its own political loyalists, you're going to get bad information, and you're going to get groupthink. And a famous Democratic example of it is the Bay of Pigs invasion, in which the President Kennedy, orders an invasion that his advisors have all come to believe is a really good idea, but they've kind of influenced each other in a group, and they've selected information, and they don't really know on the ground, and it turns out to be a terrible fiasco. So, again, it could be Democrat or Republican. The military, you want civilian oversight of the military. That's a basic idea of democracy. But oversight doesn't mean second guessing, like when somebody has been court-martialed and there's been a whole official military process of determining the guilt, to then just say, hey, I'm going to overrule all the generals and all the colonels, and I'm just going to change that because I like this person's ideology.
Yeah. And I think especially part of what you're saying at the beginning of this, where you're talking about the political bias that comes with that when you replace those people, and how it impacts our ability to respond to such things as hurricanes. With the article that you had sent me prior, or the essay that you sent me with the COVID disaster in America and the world, you were highlighting that, for example, with the handlings of the COVID response, because of the political think the term football is going back and forth, where we got the left and the right fighting over things with such as the stimulus check and everything, and it's just causing a more worse of a ripple effect.
Absolutely. So you've got one part of that, which is trying to fight COVID, in which you've got real sort of questions of public health policy. Do we invest in trying to get more emergency room beds and more ventilators? Do we tell people to wear masks? And there can be differences of opinion that are legitimate, but it's pretty dangerous when these become politicized. When this is a matter of prove you're a real leftist, prove you're a real rightist by whether you wear a mask or not. And in fact, we need the mask wearing for public health reasons. And then, as you just suggested, it also affects things like the extent to which the government gives any kind of financial help, whether it's a stimulus or a relief package or whatever else. Millions of people lose their jobs. Do you actually provide more unemployment or not? That's a question. And you might have an opinion that we shouldn't spend too much money, right? I might have an opinion we should take care of the workers better. But it's a problem when that becomes simply one party versus the other party, and no ability to figure out the actual policy that would do the best job or to reach a compromise. And it becomes, that's extremism again, polarization. We're not going to compromise. We're going to, let people starve if we have to have our way.
Yeah, and that's why with my podcast, the biggest thing I'm adamant, especially with the current culture in the US and how we police each other on our morals and values and things that we've done in the past and present. That's why it's my main focal point is to advocate positive constructive
Good.
conversation, so that way we're able to peacefully address these issues, even
Mhm.
if we agree to disagree. Like if, say, for example, the other person's 100% supported abortion, but I didn't.
Yeah,
My goal is just to be able to find that compromise so that
yeah,
way we could find
good.
solutions.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be different possible compromises, some better,
Yeah.
some worse. But if you have no ability to compromise, you have no ability to live in a democratic society.
Yeah.
And a tyrant doesn't have to compromise. He can say my way or the highway.
Hmm.
But in a democracy, you need to get people to come together,
Yeah.
and that requires an ability to compromise. And the compromises can change over time. What seemed to make sense to everybody in 1965 may not make sense to them in 2015. That's fine, but the people can decide. You realize that your podcast is part of the good story here, not just because you're saying there needs to be compromise, but because having open political discussion with a realistic effort to give it a factual basis
Hmm.
is key to having those compromises and having them work, right? So if we didn't have the open media, if you couldn't have a podcast, that would be a problem for being able to arrive democratically at a common public opinion.
Especially with how bad censorship is coming into effect now. With you see everything, all the fact checkers on Facebook. It's
Yeah.
that right there is going to eliminate the ability to have that conversation, which just based off my own interpretation, that in of itself would breed further ignorance on both sides, because they would have the mentality, well, if you're not going to even give me the opportunity to listen or the opportunity to speak my defense while not cutting out while being open to yours as well, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
then it kind
No,
of
I mean,
breeds
it does make sense. It seems to me it's a question of balance, as many
right.
things are. It's not, it's never right to have fact checkers, because we ought to let people say things that are absolute lies. And we ought to let people shout fire in theaters, and nobody is allowed to say, but there isn't any fire. And so there's a stampede out the door and people get crushed.
Yeah.
There's a good reason you're not supposed to shout fire in theaters, and you can get in trouble if you do. So that seems to me legitimate. Where the line is, where the right balance is another question. And I mean, Facebook's interesting partly because it originally had the position that it was just a platform that had no role in deciding what could be said on that platform.
Hmm.
But clearly, it's not a completely neutral platform. And then it begins to say, okay, we have to get involved. And I think we haven't worked out as a society how much we want to have anyone getting involved in doing this. But it's worth noting that there's always somebody that, if you're talking about newspapers, there are newspaper owners and
Hmm.
publishers, and they don't just publish everybody, right? If you call up the New York Times and say, I want to say the world is flat, they're not going to publish your story.
Yeah.
And so there's always somebody checking. The question is who. And what worries me about the Facebook story, in addition to are they getting the balance right, is that they're defending the principle that they should be the ones to determine, right? It's just, hey, wait a minute, who made Mark Zuckerberg king
Hmm.
that he should be determining all of this? So I may often agree with what they are saying is hate speech or is false, but I'm worried about the idea that corporate bosses have this power. And I want to know how we could have, and I don't know the answer, but I'd like to know the answer, how we could have a better democratic process for fact checking and sorting things out and determining the legitimacy of different kinds of political statements, or for that matter, medical statements. I mean, think about it. You can't be totally against censorship and be in favor of truth, right?
Right.
Because if people are able to go out and say, here, let me shoot this in your arm, and they're going to do something that kills you, right?
Right.
You got to say, okay, you've got to have, so we've got a sort of weird system in which if you get some drugs, there's an incredible bunch of small print paperwork with the drug.
Mhm.
right? So your doctor prescribes a drug and you open it up and there's 10 pages of description of possible side effects because the drug company is protecting itself from a lawsuit.
Right.
But on the other hand, you wouldn't want a system that said anything goes. You can sell anything, and whether it hurts people or not. Part of how the Food and Drug Administration got started in all of this was things like bakers putting alum and other things in bread that were at best not nutritious, but at worst poisonous,
Right.
but would make it look whiter and rise faster and be able to sell it. And a sense that needed to be regulated. So my belief is we need some regulation. Where the balance is a question.
Mm-hmm.
We need that regulation to be subject itself to democratic control, not just individuals who appoint themselves to do it, but for all kinds of speech, not just political speech.
Mm-hmm.
If there isn't some level of regulation, doesn't have to be the state, right? But some level of regulation, things won't work, right? One of the most powerful examples of regulation that developed in the history of the United States is the dictionary, right? Saying words have certain meanings and certain spellings.
Yeah.
And we're going to agree to that, right? And Merriam-Webster is going to say, or whichever other dictionary writers, and that will enable us to work better. If we know what the spellings are, this will help us. It helps us still in the computer age when we try to search for things or work online. And it depends on regulation. Or again, how far apart should the rails of a railroad be?
Yeah.
Right? If you just say, hey, do whatever you want, then the trains can't connect up with each other. They can't get across the track, right?
Yeah.
It required standard setting or an electrical outlet, right? There's no God-given rule that says 110 volts is the right voltage.
Yeah.
There's just a need to have an agreement about what the right voltage is so that you can connect all your appliances and not have them blow out, and so that you don't get killed, as you might in some other kinds of direct current or other electrical arrangements. So I think that there's a big need for standard setting.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it depends on government regulation. Sometimes it depends on cooperation among other people who are not the government.
Yeah.
But it's a mistake to imagine that freedom lies in the direction of never having any of that regulation.
Right.
Because that would make freedom completely disabling. Like, to be free, you get to spell every word however you want to spell it, whether anyone can read what you're writing or not.
Right. Yeah. And I'd say part of that too, because I remember reading On the Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and one of the things that he said is that I prefer liberty with danger than peace with slavery. And based off my recollection of what he was elaborating with the liberty with danger is that that point right there, how there's the balance that you need to regulate between how far can it go to compromise the integrity of that democracy and whatnot, between versus letting it get out of hand and whatever regulations with there as well, and
Right.
the dangers that could come with it too, like for example with the US and the rise with socialism and communism. Part of that liberty, it allows that opportunity, and so that where I think, me personally, that's where society has to take the initiative to kind of understand with their trying to think about how to explain this properly, but it's where society needs to understand with that whole issue. We need the opportunity to take a step back, listen, and not take it at full value.
Exactly. And usually find a balance.
Yeah.
There's usually not just one right answer, and it's certainly not one of the extremes, not an either or. A little bit like I said about conflict and cooperation. It's hard to imagine any society that was all conflict all the time. It would be the opposite of society. Another great social contract theorist, Thomas Hobbes, right, started to note that. He said that would be the war of all against all. Mm-hmm. Then he went to the opposite extreme. In order to not have that, we have to have absolute kings. Well, I would say he got the balance wrong. He's right that we don't want to have the war of all against all, But having absolute kings isn't the only way to avoid that.
Yeah, because that in of itself can bring across kind of the same results with authoritarian and power abuse.
Yeah, or different bad results, equally bad. And so the challenge is often one of finding the right balance between two good things or sometimes two bad things that are unavoidable. But it would be so easy if it were just good versus bad all the time.
Yeah,
This side is completely right, that side's completely wrong. Hey, easy question. Democracy is a little bit hard because the questions are mixed and because different issues get packed together in different ways. Like you always, I think almost everybody always wants to pay less taxes,
hmm
but almost everybody also wants to get more services and
yeah,
better services and have things work right. So if you ask people about taxes, cut the taxes, I hate the government. If you ask people about the motor vehicle departments, the lines were too long, I couldn't get my business done, they need to have more people at the counters, which of course costs money.
mhm,
And so we all inside us, every one of us, have these conflicting positions, these
yeah,
tensions, and none of us ever sort them out completely. We kind of work out our own compromises inside us, and the same has to go on when there are many of us trying to work together in democracy. We have to work out a stable, agreed ground.
yeah, and I think that too, especially, is where a present real issue with cancel culture, because that's where it lacks. It's the cancel culture, they're just jumping on one thing, or they're only looking at one side instead of looking at the whole concept of it, with the internal balance of finding that they're just focusing on leaning one side of that threshold instead of just finding a middle ground to actually assess it.
Well, on both sides there. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there are people who are doing what you say, the so-called cancel culture
hmm
people. But there are people who are making the accusation of cancel culture way too broad against people who
hmm
aren't doing that, and protecting people who are doing much the same sort of thing on their side. So,
Yeah.
my view is that it's um, a problem to fail to deal with what other people are saying.
Mhm.
And that problem isn't owned by one side or the other side. There's a lot of that failure around.
Yeah, and like a very good example, especially what's going on with Chris Pratt, for example, because he's getting cancel culture in social media's terms been going after him because Avengers, they did a fundraiser for Joe Biden, but Chris Pratt as well as other actors, they weren't a part of it. But Pratt was targeted in particular for not having any type of political voice or opinion, or for not supporting Biden or anything like that. And
Yeah, again, I think this goes on a lot. I don't particularly welcome it from either side,
yeah,
but you could go a long list of complaints going way back, not just in the current politics, where the right hates and wants to, in effect, cancel
mhm,
people on the left. So, what was going on when the House Un-American Activities Committee under McCarthy started saying that anyone who was accused of being left wing was no longer allowed to work in Hollywood? That
oh
was an
wow,
extreme cancel culture, right?
wow,
You can't write a movie, you can't make a movie, you can't act in a movie because you are possibly a communist.
mhm,
So you've got extremes. That's coming from the right wing,
mhm,
and it's sort of doing a cancel culture thing. And it did it on tens of thousands of Americans who lost their jobs
mhm,
because of these accusations that they were communists or in some way left wing. And I say accusations, some of them were probably communists, and some of, that may or may not have been a problem, and we can have a discussion on whether it was a
mhm,
problem. But accusations are an issue. And a lot of this goes on in social media now in the so-called, whether it's left or right, cancel culture or the politics of the right,
mhm,
as accusations, not substantiated, you
mhm,
know. Hillary Clinton is running a child sex ring out of the basement of the pizza parlor in Washington. And then
yeah,
somebody else says, hey, that pizza parlor doesn't even have a basement, and you get a whole back and forth issue. But lots of damage is being done by the accusations.
yeah,
before anyone checks it. And, again, I think we should all, whichever political persuasion we happen to come from, worry about this, because it is the enemy of a potentially, viable democratic society.
Yeah, and to address a good example too of that, because of course I want to always address both sides of it, because both sides are just as equally wrong, just as equally right. Like with Governor Whitmore, for example, with the attempted kidnapping, it was based off of I forget the exact peoples that were involved in it, but they were part of this far right extremist anti-government group called Wolverine Watchmen, and their whole intentions behind targeting and kidnapping Governor Whitmore was based off the belief that I don't know if they termed it her draconian measures, like how it's been termed with handling the lockdowns, but they often refer to her as a tyrant and everything like that, and they were completely against it. But that is like another example where that lack of balance comes in, where it can affect both sides and the inability to actually look at the full spectrum.
Right. And so one issue is whether they were right, right, in their accusation. So they believe Whitmore was violating their basic constitutional rights to freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we agree with them or not, another issue is whether that gave them the authority to try to kidnap her or to threaten violence against the government in Michigan. And I think, these are both valid issues that can be debated, but one of them, what they do, becomes a question of public order in a different way. Right?
Yeah.
If I argue with you and I say completely stupid things while I argue with you, that's really different from shooting you. And so we have legitimate reasons to try to maintain public order and peace and so forth, and not have kidnapping be a tactic of politics.
Right.
Independent of whether it's coming from the right or the left, or whether we agree or disagree with the views of those who are saying it.
Right.
It.
Yeah. And then I'd say this is my own personal thought process, because I was talking about, because I talk a lot about cancel culture as well, because that's part of the emphasis of why I focus on having compromise and productive conversations. But me and a family member of mine, we were talking about cancel culture, and we were watching a music video that was kind of based off the Salem witch trials, and how the lack of evidence and all the false accusations, and how it destroyed the livelihoods of individuals then. So I was just kind of wanting to see like your personal take on that, with like drawing some parallels with how, for example, with mob mentality, how during the Salem witch trials, that's what dictated the false accusations. And then with social media, you have mob mentality where it dictates you did one thing wrong from the past or posted one thing wrong. That makes
and
it
in actual
power.
mobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree, and I'm not in favor of witchcraft or witch trials, either one.
Yeah.
But one thing is to notice what is going on that is stressing people who are ordinarily fairly reasonable to do things like this, to believe in the stories, to decide to cancel the witches by drowning or burning them, or to believe that it was a legitimate test, that you dunk them underwater and if they survive, and there were things going on in the larger community. So we can try to explain the Salem witch trials or other things, but that doesn't mean we want to have that be our practice for how we get things done.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to do the explanation. So it's important, I mentioned Joe McCarthy and the movement of the 1950s, trying to define what was Americanism and stop all those who were, quote, un-American,
right,
from holding jobs, or especially holding any national security relevant jobs. The Salem witchcraft, that example, and 100 others we could give, point out that the idea of trying to cancel out the people you disagree with, or the people who do something that upsets you, or you heard a rumor that they do something that upsets you, that's old. That exists through history.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right to bring up something like Salem. Say it didn't come just from social media.
Yeah. And I
How
think
does
Salem
social
is a good
media
example
relate to
because it's
this?
even
It
less.
enables rumors to circulate faster and farther. The impact of social media is not on whether there are rumors, and it's not on whether people have the truth or are idiots or anything else, except the velocity of the rumors, right? How
Yeah.
far do they go? How fast do they go? And therefore, how readily can they be checked?
Yeah, because that was a key trait when, because I made some little notes in comparison between like the Salem witch trials and how society acted and versus now with cancel culture, because I like the mob mentality. There's also the pressures to conform to the societal norms and what they're doing, and often results in like the alienation and destruction of certain individuals based off that. But this thing that I emphasized that was more so a feature of cancel culture in this time, since I know that this whole thing has been around for a long time, was the issue of society blowing up and exaggerating individuals' past mistakes or wrongdoings by assuming that those past or present actions, moral flaws, whatever else makes up their whole identity. They then deem these individuals as incapable of changing their ways and uses social media as a means to destroy their livelihood. They'll also alienate those individuals by ignoring their good deeds and any active effort on their end to improve and better themselves as human beings. And I think that more so pertains with social media because of the scale of reach that can happen, because you could have one false thing about you spread, but if it reaches a million people and you only got one voice, there's the difficulty of feeding through to get the truth, and then people are just so quick to jump on it, and they use social media as a way to enforce that, I'd say.
Right. I think that's true. And I think where the accusations are false, almost everybody would agree on this, although the damage might often get done.
Mm-hmm.
Where the accusations are true, I mean, and part of what you were reading out there was about the possibility that people did one bad thing
Mm-hmm.
or one part of them was bad. Well, their, behavior in sexual relationships was all bad, but that, should that mean that their art is all bad?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's distinctive to cancel culture, but there is a question about that that text you were reading out, whether it's you writing it or whoever it was.
Yeah, that was me just putting in my notes.
But that got at one issue is whether it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Another issue is whether people are given the opportunity to redeem themselves, change their ways, move on.
Yeah.
A third issue is whether certain sorts of things are so serious that they really should remove people from their jobs or from public roles.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that child sex abuse is so serious that you should, possibility A, not be allowed to be a kindergarten teacher,
Mm-hmm.
B, be sent to prison, C, be executed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, by and large in our society, we're going to settle on A and B,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't get a job with children, and if it's serious, you'll probably go to prison.
Yeah.
But then when you get into other things, the Me Too movement or this or that, that's where the debate comes in. And so when the accusations are false and it's just a rumor, that's one thing, and too much damage gets done. But when the accusations are true, what is the right solution to
Right.
this? And lots of, I think, the debate and lots of the discomfort in many areas, not just sexuality that I was using an example, that
Yeah.
in politics and a variety of other areas, comes from concern that if you will, the cancellation is too extreme, it's too categorical.
Mm-hmm.
And so we shouldn't confuse the question of truth, because sometimes people really are guilty.
Yeah.
Right, with the question of what's the appropriate punishment to fit the crime. And we need to have good mechanisms for figuring that out. And when with social media and a lot of mass media too, we lose the ability to be very nuanced.
Yeah.
Say, hey, that's bad, but it's not as bad as this other thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it tends to be all or nothing a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's definitely what we see now, because with all the political rifts, the social rifts and everything, with the inability to have conversation, kind of stems from that as well. And then an example that I wanted to bring, like when we're talking about the false accusations and how it comes like that, just because it popped in my head, like with Kevin Hart, for example, with the Oscars, where it was indeed something that was just kind of way taken out of context and didn't acknowledge the actual change and positive change in Kevin Hart, was when he was let go of from the Oscars for that tweet that he made in regards to homosexuality like 7-9 years ago. And that's where that kind of plays in. And I think we certainly need to find a balance for it.
Right. So I only vaguely remember that particular case. So I don't have any opinion about that. I do think that homophobia is bad and you shouldn't go around attacking homosexuals. I have no idea, what the level of seriousness of his action was. What I would say though is that the social media is almost sort of a machine for taking things out of context.
Yeah.
If you wanted to design a media system in order to take things out of context, you would design something like social media, which is precisely the enemy of context, right? You're not putting in all the nuances. You're not giving all the background details.
Especially with Twitter too, for example.
Characters, or maybe in the new Twitter, 240. You're pulling out something, and you're going to get a lot more errors. Whatever we decide are the errors, maybe we don't even agree at what the errors are, but you're going to get a lot more of them. These decontextualization errors.
Yeah, and because I remember at the very beginning of this, you were pointing out that there are some positives to social media, but obviously we've been talking about mostly the negative things, like in this situation, for example. Like with my personal belief, where social media can play a positive is when it's kind of keeping the higher figures, the monopolies and things like that in check. It gives a voice for the people to collectively do it. Like, for example, with all the monopolies that's popping up right now, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, the positive aspect I believe of social media in that context is that it will give people the ability to have a collective voice to help address this issue, to keep things in check.
Yeah, so social media can be very democratic and give a wider popular voice. It's potentially, at least, more interactive than conventional media. If there's an article in a newspaper, you don't have much chance to talk back. You can now tweet it and say, I disagree with this article or whatever. So there's a new level of interactive comment in social media, which is potentially valuable and democratic. And it draws a lot of people into these discussions who wouldn't be in them otherwise, which is potentially democratic. But it's vulnerable to manipulation. So I happen to agree with you that it's good for holding people in power to account. But I would point out what goes on a lot of the time is some people in power trying to use social media to mobilize people against other people in power. So Donald Trump's going to mobilize you against Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos maybe is going to mobilize you against Donald Trump. Neither one of those is the spontaneous view of the whole population.
Yeah, like for example, because I remember seeing all the conspiracies on Facebook with like George Soros, for example, that he's funding these violent protesters come in and infiltrate the peaceful protests, whatnot, do that. But another example where you have some people of that authority that are able to do that to push their own agenda.
You mean the people who are attacking Soros or Soros?
Yeah, because unless I misinterpret it incorrectly, because like how you said with the people from the top that'll use.
I was just pointing out, I don't think Soros ever did that. I think that's an occasion of an outright lie.
Yeah, I think that's
if he had done that, he would be a powerful person doing that.
I think it's a full-blown lie. I won't like say it's truth. I treat it as a conspiracy, but that's just an example of what I see on Facebook where it pushes that.
So there are always media influencers, the people who own the media, the people who influence them by buying advertising. And then they say, well, if you want our advertising, you can't talk about this on your show, whatever it is. And the social media make their money by getting advertising hits. And so they are biased towards clickbait, whether it's true or not. They're biased towards controversy They're biased towards whatever draws people in. So there's a kind of basic contradiction about putting them in charge of determining what's true.
Right.
That doesn't mean somebody shouldn't be determining it, but they're probably not well positioned to do it. And with the Soros example, I mean, the widely repeated accusations against Soros are, I think, false. That doesn't mean Soros doesn't want to influence things. It means his method of influencing things is to support education, to support research in various areas, to support political advertising. He certainly wants to change people's minds on some issues. I think, that's true. And he uses his money and his foundation to do that by legitimate procedures. Like, we do
Right.
believe it's okay to buy an advertisement. We do believe it's okay to publish a book.
Right.
And what's troubling about the accusation of Soros, aside from there just being false in this, and sort of covers other things, is that they're almost all anti-Semitic. They almost all will mention he's a Jew, right? And it's kind of a hint. If somebody is just making an accusation about political interference, they don't have to mention that. If they mention that, it's a big clue that they're probably promoting a biased conspiracy theory for other reasons.
Yeah, then because like, especially since the quarantine has gone down, and even before that, I've been seeing on Facebook there's been an increase in not just left-wing conspiracy theories that go around, but also right-wing conspiracy theories, especially surrounding the pandemic itself. And I know with George Soros, it was a very hard right-wing push in regards to that conspiracy that George Soros had that involvement. So
and it has roots also in Hungary, where he comes from, where the dictator in Hungary wanted to discredit Soros, partly because Soros had founded a university and had been supporting democratic groups there. And so naturally the dictator didn't like it, though ironically, the dictator got his own college scholarship from Soros. And, I mean, it's a complicated set of stories and a complicated world with all that. But your basic point, things will come from right and left, is correct. Things will come from neither right nor left, but still self-interested stories. Corporations want to sell stuff, Russia wanting to sow discord in the US elections. So Russia might be acting to support President Trump, but they might just be acting to stir up trouble and undermine the US. And so it's not necessarily left or right all the time. There are a variety of ways in which people try to manipulate and try to undermine reasonable public discourse in society.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think, since we'll be wrapping it up soon, what I definitely want to focus on now is what kind of solutions can we have to these issues? Like what on a societal level, because obviously part of all these issues going on is also a collective issue amongst the mindset and mentality of our people as a whole. So what kind of solutions do you think there are there to where we could have the opportunity? Because like with the essay you sent me with how the pandemic can be an opportunity for us to reignite our values, and not just with everything outside, with work, with the places we go to engage and whatnot, but just overall as a whole, give us an opportunity to reignite our values and to be more productive and work towards more of a positive change.
Well, so the pandemic or any other crisis can shake you out of assuming that you should just keep going down the path you were on, and make you think about it. Different path. What would that path be? And there's a saying sometimes that you waste a good crisis if you don't rethink the path you were on. A lot of people would say, we wasted the financial crisis, 2008-9, because it pointed out the problems with the extreme financial domination of our society, and we didn't do anything about it. And so we'll eventually have more crises and these kinds. The odds are we will not change fundamentally because of COVID, but the possibility is that being pushed to think differently will make for some change. And it doesn't have to be revolutionary change. It could be things like COVID has made those of us who are sheltering at home or shut in much more aware of people who are delivering stuff to us. It's made us much more aware of healthcare workers and other care workers. And that could be translated into more support for those workers in various ways, right? Without dealing with capitalism versus socialism or other big questions. Now, it might be that one or the other of capitalists or socialists are better for the workers, but leave that aside, right? We could recognize the workers. We could recognize how much we depend on local communities that we now feel a bit cut off from because of our distancing. And say, well, how do we rebuild these local communities? Do we need some investment in it? So we need not just a national stimulus bill, but we need some decentralized support for local communities to be able to rebuild their public places, their ways of connecting their lives. And that could even make us look at those communities that got hard hit by deindustrialization or other changes and say, we'd be a lot better off if they were strong communities.
Yeah.
And that we all have a stake in this, because part of what an infectious disease shows you is that we're all vulnerable to each other's illnesses. And so if we just say, hey, I'm just taking care of myself, that's sort of a recipe for potentially getting COVID because, you are vulnerable. And COVID doesn't respect entirely whether you're rich or not. It's true that if you are rich, you have some advantages, but not. It's worth looking at the COVID story globally. Most of the COVID action has been in pretty rich countries. It's Europe, it's the United States, it's relatively well-off countries. It's also Latin America, it's also other places, but it's not that it's just the poor countries that get hit. And it's in this country, it's not just the poor neighborhoods. People in the poor neighborhoods get worse hospitals, but people in rich neighborhoods also get sick. So, my hope would be this would make us want to renew democratic ways of solving problems so that we would solve the COVID problem, we'd solve some of the economic problem that follows from COVID, and we would be better able to address a new pandemic if one comes, or to deal with climate change or other issues down the road, which will require us to have some pretty good societal problem-solving capabilities.
Yeah. Because I remember, with the beginning of that, you were talking about how the pandemic and the quarantine has allowed light on more things so that we could work towards fixing them. Like, for example, in your essay, you were writing about how it showed that there was a split labor market that was disproportionately towards women, minorities, and immigrants.
Yeah, so one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is we've dramatically reduced our industry and manufacturing, and dramatically increased the service sector and what I would call logistical work, like deliveries and warehouses and stuff, working for Costco, working for Walmart. And that economic transformation came with two problems. We destroyed a lot of the lives of the industrial workers, and we didn't help them survive better. We didn't do enough to support them, partly because other people were making money off of it. And so, there it went. But it also produced a workforce in these service jobs that was much more minorities, much more female, much less often protected by unions than the old industrial workforce. The steel workers had unions, the tire makers had unions, the auto workers had unions, the coal miners had unions, but the healthcare aides don't have necessarily, and the Uber drivers don't have, and there's a sort of fight about that in the election in California right now. And so we shouldn't just notice the bad things that were done to manufacturing workers. We should notice the vulnerable position of the service workers. And try to figure out ways to support them for the sake of all of us, because I'll get there sooner than you, but you'll also get old and need nursing home care.
Yeah.
And so you really don't want that to be a completely unsupported occupation.
Yeah. And because I look at things in the future perspective with, especially with all the stuff going on, and with that too, with our
I was being
ability.
really future oriented when I said
Yeah.
you'd eventually get old.
Yeah, but I have the mindset where I look very far in the future because I understand, especially big things that are going on with the pandemic, for example, too. It could have
Yeah.
a very long impact on not just my kids' generation, but so on
Yeah.
and so forth. So I see seeing these things, and especially too with trying to find solutions. Ideally, my personal feeling is that we definitely got to work towards being able to have civil discussions without alienating other people's beliefs, being able to accept it even if you don't agree with it, just accept it and just move forward from there.
Yeah. And, one of the things that emergencies and crises tend to do is to speed up whatever else was going on.
Mhm.
Sometimes, as I was saying, I hoped they make us reevaluate where we're headed, but often. So I think, a lot of the pandemic is speeding up how much we transition to using electronic communication like you and I are doing right now, whether it's social media or it's podcasts or it's webinars or all these things. And universities and schools will rely more and more on this. So this might have been a transition that would have taken place over 20, 30, 40 years, right, with a slow process. But the pandemic is going to speed it up. It's going to demonstrate how we can do this. It's going to lead to people thinking, oh, this is potentially a better way to do it or a more economical way or something. And so we're going to get more use of these technologies. That only makes it more important to figure out how to use these technologies well, because we're not going to have 25 years to gradually work it out.
Yeah.
We're going to really fast have more and more kids going to school online and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think too, like my a word that I was personally using in regards to like the quarantine, with it being able to accelerate and really bring attention to all these things going on, is that it's almost kind of like a great awakening. Not like a full extent, but to the extent where we're all kind of stuck at home in this quarantine, but we have this access through social media technology to really catch on to things
Yeah.
and to see what's really going on. And we could use that as a means to improve ourselves as a whole and not just fall into the rabbit hole of the fake
Yeah.
news and false information.
Totally agree. And if it slows us down a little bit, makes us stay at home, maybe that gives us more chance to reflect on what our values are and where we want
Mhm.
to go.
Yeah. And I think even if in the situation, because of course I'm going to follow the idealistic way of there's no need for violence, no need for this revolutionary acts. There's the peaceful, there's a more ideal solution to all this. But like, unfortunately, as time has proven again and again, that there sometimes where just reality is going to hit no matter what. And so my mindset with how I view things, especially at this point in human history, is that even if we're going to get worse from here and we're not going to actually make that change, I believe that that'll happen sometime in the future, because as we fall, we'll rise once again.
So
And
it's still worth fighting for.
exactly, because like I say that society, especially right now, is like mankind is in their teenage years, because the fact that we're all fighting like children and we can't come to civil disagreements like adults used to be able to, that at least based off everything I got told growing up. So that's something that I definitely push forward with it as well.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that there is no single path in which we just have progress or we just go to hell.
Hmm.
There's an ebb and a flow and an up and down and sideways turns to human history.
Hmm.
And that will happen in the future. Now, there may be a huge catastrophe, global warming or something like that, or we get hit by an asteroid or I don't know, whatever. But by and large, what will happen is we will solve some problems. Things will get better. It will turn out that there were problems with our solutions. They
Hmm.
will need new problem solving. And sometimes we will fail to produce that. And
Yeah.
that will lead us to have problems again. So, you look at American history and you can say there's been lots of progress over the 250 years of American history.
Hmm.
You can also say there was the Civil War. There were other points that didn't look so much like progress.
Mhm.
And so we have to ask not only what's the overall course of progress, where I agree with what you're saying about that. We have to ask how good we are at picking ourselves up and starting again when we get knocked down.
Yeah. And I think people especially are only focused on that downfall. They're not looking so much as the future where we can pick it up or the possibility of that opening up. So they kind of get lost in the rabbit hole of that.
Yeah. I mean, the only long period of time in which inequality went down in American society was mostly prosperous and cooperative was the 30 years after World War II.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you should want to have the Great Depression or want to have a war, but it does mean that when you have a calamity, you have the opportunity to try to put some new institutions in place and make them work.
And,
And they worked for a while. They didn't work forever, right? So the kind of institutions that were put in place after the war, which were not all good or not perfect in any way, were reasonably effective for 30 years or so. And then they began to run into more and more problems. And we get, another era of sort of frustration with institutions, attacking institutions and so forth.
yeah.
But the moral of the story is that there won't be a straight path, and we'll have to stay awake and keep solving problems and keep figuring out which way to go. We never get to coast. We never get to say, hey, that's it. We've now got the perfect democracy. No problem.
Yeah.
We've now got the perfect economy. No problem. Things always keep changing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I certainly hope, at least with, even if we progressively get worse in the US, I really hope that it's going to reinstill the values for people that desire to improve the situation, and they just say enough is enough, and we collectively as a whole stop this and just actually fix it.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, I can't support this with evidence. It's my bias, my personal
Yeah.
personality almost. I'm optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic.
Hmm.
Things might get worse before they get better, but they are going to get better
Hmm.
in various ways. I am optimistic that we are going to find ways to rebuild democracy. Now, then the next big challenge is, having rebuilt democracy, can we solve some other problems
Right.
with the economy or with climate change or whatever? But um, I am hopeful that we are near the low point on this damage to democracy problem, and things will start getting better on that.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, I think we should be all good. It's around that time. So, hey, again, I appreciate you so much for coming on. I'd absolutely love to have you as the first guest. And hey, maybe in the future we could have something again.
Pleasure to talk with you, Josh, and I'm honored to be your first guest.
Thank you so much, sir. And
Take
for
care.
those of you fans, yeah, you too, sir. And those for my fans that are watching, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And we'll see you in the next one.